Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in this world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, your moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. Well, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you'll be able to access it on demand. We'll be sending out an email to all registered attendees with a link to the webinar. And also we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during the presentation you have a question for our panelists, don't wait, just use your GoToWebinar control panel, submit your question, and we'll take a few minutes near the end of the presentation and go over the audience questions. Okay, and with that, we'll go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Dominate your enterprise and your software delivery using XebiaLabs and AWS. Our speakers today are Jay Yaris, Partner Solutions Architect for DevOps at AWS, and Tim Buntel, DevOps Advocate at XebiaLabs. Hi guys, welcome gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Charlene. Really great to be here. As always, we have a great topic, so.
Awesome.
So
All right,
excited
well
to be
then
here.
I am just going to turn it over to you, Tim, and let you do
Sure.
your thing.
Sure. Yeah, thanks everybody. Tim Buntel here from XebiaLabs. Really thrilled that you could join us today. We've had some great conversations here in this webinar series in the past, and one of the things I'm really excited about today is not only are we able to talk about the solution and present some really pragmatic information to you so you can take action back in your own organization to try some of these sort of benefits. But we've also put together some really good resources. We've got lots of sample code, and you'll be able to follow along and have your own experience with the technologies that we're discussing today. So Jay, thanks again so much for joining as well. You want to say hi to everybody?
Hey everyone, thrilled to be here and thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to this webinar and hoping everybody can gather some great knowledge out of it.
Good. And I will remind folks again, please do take advantage of that question panel. We always love to hear folks give us some feedback as we're going through the content, and we should have plenty of time to talk about that at the end. So, often when I start having these conversations with folks about DevOps, I like to really talk about why first, right? And one of the best sources that I can point to, and I do with my customers all the time, is the Dora Research team does their annual State of DevOps survey. So it's a really wide-reaching view of the state of DevOps throughout the global software development economy. Dr. Nicole Forsgren has joined us for several webinars, and actually just this week on Tuesday, we hosted a webinar with Dora founder and CTO Jez Humble, who dove pretty deeply into the new version of the report, which I think only came out a few weeks ago. So that recording is available on the XebiaLabs website. Do check that out. It's a great resource to really understand the impact that these types of digital transformations and DevOps initiatives can have in companies. So, I'm going to pull out a couple of key points here that I think are great takeaways, just to give you a sense of why this would be worthwhile to do in your enterprise, in your organization. So the first is really looking at some numbers from the survey about what we're calling the elite performers, right? So these are organizations that have really embraced DevOps, digital transformations in their organizations, and the outcomes that we see compared to the folks who haven't done this are really incredibly striking and exciting from a development perspective. So starting with this sort of notion of agility, right? At the end of the day, the most important thing to an organization is to deliver value to their customers through digital experiences. And this doesn't matter what kind of company you are, whether you're a company that actually sells something called software, or if you sell retail goods or other products or services. Ultimately, your customers are going to engage with you through digital experiences. That's just the way the world works today. So our ability to get those digital experiences in the hands of our customers really rapidly is paramount. So when we look at elite performers in these categories, the good news is they have an amazing capability of getting those experiences in the hands of their customers more frequently and faster. So the frequency of deployments, 46 times more frequent than the organizations that haven't embraced these principles. So what does that mean for your business? Well, it means you're getting that value into the market faster, ahead of your competitors, and it's giving you an opportunity to gauge the results of that. So you can take that feedback and adjust your plans. If you're waiting and you're only delivering your software once a quarter or a couple of times a year, you're not able to outpace your competitors, but you're also missing opportunities to gauge that feedback so you can continually tweak and improve the experiences you give for customers. So then the other statistic that I like to point to is the lead time, right? So essentially when your business has an idea for value for your customers, from the moment that idea is conceived all the way till that experience is in the hands of your customers in production, that's really wasteful, right? The faster you can get that idea into production, the faster you can allow that value to come into your customers' hands and get feedback. Well, the good news is folks who have adopted these practices have an astronomical benefit in terms of shrinking that lead time, 2,500 times faster from commit to deploy than the organizations that aren't doing that. So you're bringing value to your customers more frequently throughout the year, and it takes you much less time to get them into the hands of customers. So that's on sort of getting value there. We also see amazing results when it comes to how good the experience is at the end of the day. So it's not just that we're bringing lots of software into the hands of users. We also want to make sure that software is reliable, high quality, performant, and delivering on the business value that you intended. Again, really incredible numbers there in the new report on elite performers. Basically, the number of times that a change coming into production fails is dramatically dropped, a seventh as likely for those changes to result in a failure in production. Now, obviously, this is quite important because as you're making this much higher cadence of deployments, you want to make sure that you don't have to worry about whether it'll work or not. You don't want everybody glued to their pager, kind of waiting to see if things succeeded. But we know from the data that that these higher performers are more likely to have stable, no incident deployments. Now, at the same time, I do like to say that it's okay to occasionally have failures, right? Because if you are so afraid of having any failures, you may be reluctant to take some chances and try some things out. So the other statistic that I like to point to is it's okay if you have a failure as long as you can recover from the incident really quickly. And that's another category where the high performers really shine. They dramatically reduce the amount of time that's required to roll back or recover from incidents. So you're starting with higher quality deployments to begin with this lower change rate. But if for some reason a problem does happen, no problem, you can recover from it incredibly quickly. So that sort of pressure to always get it right isn't there. You can be a little bit more outgoing when it comes to bringing value to the market. And then finally, we don't want to forget about the impact that this has on the teams and on developers. Obviously, engineers and developers and everyone in the software development process, these are passionate, creative people that want to work on cool things, right? And if you're spending a lot of time doing manual tasks and following playbooks for deployments, or you're reworking things and fixing past issues, that lowers satisfaction in work. And we all know when it comes to hiring good technical talent, that's a challenge today. So we want to make sure that we can point to an environment where people feel that they can spend time on the things that count. And again, this year's report really emphasizes that. So much less time in the elite performers spent on manual work, which we'll talk about in a minute when we start to talk about some of the great automation that we can expose through these platforms with AWS and XebiaLabs. But also I wanted to point out this 20% more time spent on new work, right? So this means of the entire amount of effort that engineers are putting into development, it's that stuff that's going to really move the needle when it comes to competitive situation and customer satisfaction. It's working on those new things. It's not going back and responding to incidents or rework. So you're ending up with a lot higher quality software being delivered quickly and stably, but also in a way that frees up your team to invest in really high value. And over time, the report continues to see improvement. So when you look at some of those specific categories, the lead time for changes, the time to restore service, year over year since Dora has been doing this report, we see these elite performers continuing to make really great strides. So it's really clear that DevOps isn't just a trend. These digital transformations really impact the businesses that embrace them with consistent results. So I do encourage everyone to check out that recorded webinar with Jez from earlier in the week on XebiaLabs site, but then also go to Dora and download the full report. It's a PDF is available with all of this information. It really will help you make the case for DevOps in your organization. So if we're confident that there's great impact here, well then how do we get started? Well, at XebiaLabs, we have a tool that's called the Periodic Table of DevOps, where we look at the entire space of solutions that are available to teams that want to embrace digital transformations with DevOps. And as you can see, we're quickly getting to the point where the DevOps periodic table is exceeding the number of entries in the actual periodic table. So when you have so many tools that they outstrip the building blocks of the entire universe, you probably are at a position where there's too many vendors moving too quickly. But the reason I point this out, it's a useful tool. Please go to our website and play around with it. But the reason I point it out is because you would imagine that if DevOps was simply a matter of dropping in a tool, if it was simply a matter of picking the right product and installing it, then every single organization would be having those numbers that we saw in elite performers. But in reality, we're out there talking to enterprises of all sizes day in and day out, and we realize that while good tools are an important enabler of these digital transformations, a tool isn't really enough. There's a lot more to it. So the key to DevOps is understanding how do I combine great tools and great platforms with the other elements that are required to kind of scale. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today through examples of the technology that's available in XebiaLabs Platform and AWS, particularly looking at this challenge of scaling. And one that we're going to look at today is that wait time. Key to the performance numbers that we were seeing in the Dora report is automation, right? It's shrinking down the wait time between when a task is being done and when the next task starts. What we see here in this value stream map on the left is that in between all of these tasks in the typical process of delivering value to your customers are these periods of wait, right? And if you get to a point where the wait time is exceeding the task time, you've got a tremendous amount of waste that hopefully you can shrink by automating those tasks. So we're going to go deeply into that today when we take a look at how an automated release pipeline with the XebiaLabs platform can combine with all of the tools and services available in AWS to really help shrink that wait time and make a highly efficient automated process of getting your software to market. But we'll also, as we're going through, touch on a couple of the other things that are really important when it comes to scaling in an enterprise specifically. So if you think about a small department or a cloud native organization, it's pretty easy to do these kinds of situations where you're having a fully automated CD pipeline, you've got a small team, they're all working together. But time and again, we see a number of other issues that I've listed here when it comes to scaling that in an enterprise. Organization might have success with a small pilot project, but when you start to roll that out, you have a number of other issues that come up, and we're going to see those echoed as we go through the demo in a moment. Things like compliance. How do you make sure that you're controlling access to functionality, being able to have visibility into who did what and when? This could be for compliance purposes to make sure that certain regulatory compliance issues are respected within the process, but even visibility outside of those kind of formal places, business owners or other stakeholders needing to understand where in the process the software delivery lies. Maintainability and repeatability becomes a huge issue. When you're a tiny team just kind of working in isolation, it's easy to turn to your colleague sitting next to you and ask her how something was put together. But as you scale through the enterprise, you want to make sure that that all of the operations that are behind that software delivery are easily maintainable and that you can have standards in place so that they're repeatable at scale. And then finally, we see a lot of the early stage implementations rely heavily on just the team that's building software, which tends to be technical folks, right? Makes sense. And they tend to use the tools that are familiar to them. They want to code everything, and they want to have everything in a highly technical sort of style, which is great for them, but it leaves out the reality that in many enterprises, there's lots of other non-technical people who are involved in the software delivery process, right? Either as stakeholders or direct participants. And we want to make sure that they are able to participate in that as well. So as we talk about how XebiaLabs and AWS are going to fit together, we'll talk a lot about this ability to automate and kind of encapsulate functionality in a way that's repeatable and maintainable. But you'll also hear us talk about some of these other issues. And I encourage you, as you're thinking about your own DevOps initiative, think not only about the immediate needs, but how you're going to scale that when it comes time, when you start to get those successful numbers and you want to take it enterprise-wide. So just kind of briefly, a little tiny bit about XebiaLabs, if folks are unfamiliar with us. So XebiaLabs has been around really since the term DevOps started, about 10 years now. And our focus is 100% on delivering a platform to deliver DevOps to the enterprise. So we view this as this task of not only the automation that we're going to talk about here, but the intelligence, the control, the maintainability, the compliance, visibility, all of these aspects that are required to be successful with DevOps at enterprise scale. And that's what we've done traditionally, and that's what we continue to do with a large number of the leading companies in the world at the very largest scale across industries, helping them with success across the world, recognized by analysts, and you can kind of go into all of that yourself. But so we'll talk about the tools much more deeply, but I do want to point to this so that we really have been doing this for a long time. We've seen a lot of organizations struggle to achieve the kind of success that we saw in those numbers at the beginning. And I see our role at XebiaLabs as baking some of those best practices and that learning into our product so that you can take advantage of the learning that's come from the folks before you who have achieved some of those success. So how does it work? I'll go through this pretty quickly because I want to be able to turn things over to Jay and then come back to XebiaLabs. We'll show you all of these components in context through a demo. But really, when we think about the process of enterprise DevOps, it's built around, typically around this kind of CD pipeline where we have a number of stages in which there's lots and lots of different products that you saw back in the periodic table. And what XebiaLabs Platform does is focuses on each of these components and helps kind of bring it all together in a way that satisfies those enterprise needs. So from the deployment automation piece, where you're in this highly iterative cycle of building and testing and releasing and deploying software and provisioning, we're going to take a look at that in context of the AWS tools in a moment. Then up to elevate that one step further where it comes to the release that exists both before and after that piece. There's a lot of stuff that happens all the way back to the planning stage, and there's an awful lot that happens after that software has been released in production when you're getting into operation and feedback and feeding the process in a cycle to start all over again. So that's where we come in with some capabilities around release orchestration, which you'll see shortly. And then we also know that it's important for organizations to understand how are they performing and what's the impact that all of this investment and effort is yielding. That's where this idea of DevOps intelligence comes. It's really exposing that to teams and helping them know how are they doing, but how can they improve in the future. And now when it comes to releasing this software, a lot of our customers are relying really heavily today on the AWS platform. So I've been yapping away here for for too long. Jay, you want to kind of have a quick intro to the folks about what we mean when we say that AWS services and platform?
I'm happy to, Tim. So XebiaLabs runs on AWS, or it can run on AWS, but in addition to that, as Tim pointed out, from a provisioning perspective, through some of the integrations that are available through the XebiaLabs platform, primarily through CloudFormation integrations, as well as through Fargate integration and code pipeline integrations, you can provision and manage a number of different services within your AWS account, primarily EC2 instances, Lambda, again, Fargate as well. So you can, we're not going to go into detail on specifically each of these services or all of these services, but I will speak a little bit about Fargate in particular, a little further on in the examples that we're going to provide and also the workflow.
Great. So let me drill into this just a little bit to set the context for folks, so that you can show some of the examples in just a moment. So the XebiaLabs platform is constantly evolving. We've just released a version 8.2 of that platform, and there's a lot of capabilities here around working with AWS for enterprise customers. But what you saw in the previous slide were these components of the deployment automation and the release orchestration. And those work together to deliver the solutions for folks who are leveraging AWS. So the kind of quick thing that you're going to see as we walk through this example is some tasks that are happening in code and in the infrastructure, and some things that are being exposed through the XebiaLabs platform. So XL Release is that orchestrator component that allows you to automate and manage and report and have insight and control over all of those tasks. And the XL Release template that represents that software release can talk to XL Deploy, which is the deployment automation tool that actually has all of that communication with the various Amazon services. So these tools work together in a kind of a unified solution. So it gives teams a single way to interact with both the release at a higher level through the orchestration capabilities, as well as down in the low level of all of the tasks that are going to be important for provisioning, deploying, and operating the software on top of AWS. So whether that be EC2 or S3 or ECS, or as Jay just mentioned, Fargate, which is newly supported in the 8.2 platform as well. So I'm really excited to be able to show this demo and provide the content to everybody today, leveraging the Fargate support that's new in 8.2. So So why don't I flip it over to you here, and I think you're going to walk us through kind of how the flow will work, and then I'll come back with the XebiaLabs piece in a moment. So here, you should be presenter now.
I think I am, and I am sharing my screen. So,
yep, looks good.
Great. So, when Tim and I were collaborating on this webinar for you, we thought it would probably be more valuable rather than just listen to us speaking about the value proposition for our services, but to also provide you with some hands-on practical examples that you can use both from a learning perspective, but also as a reference for later on. So with that said, I wanted to kind of go over a workflow. So we have a GitHub repo that I'll show you shortly with some sample code and templates that are actually going to map directly to this workflow I'm about to present. And the way the workflow works in this case is, you're welcome to use whichever environment you're comfortable with. So from an AWS perspective and from this webinar, we chose to use AWS Cloud9. Now, Cloud9, for those of you who may not be familiar, is our cloud-based integrated development environment. So this IDE allows you to write, run, debug your code all within a browser. It's 100% cloud-based, so that means that you can access it from anywhere. All you need is an internet connection. And it includes support for JavaScript, Python, PHP, and a number of other tools. Also of particular interest is that you can also share this development environment with other developers in your team to allow real-time collaboration. So what we did in terms of the examples in this webinar is, as I mentioned before, we have a GitHub repo that we set up with some sample code for you. So the workflow begins with that Cloud9 environment that you would launch and the source in that GitHub repo, which we can then clone into our Cloud9 environment. So subsequently, the demo is also going to provision an infrastructure for you, the initial infrastructure that will allow you to use the XebiaLabs platform and then be able to run through a couple of exercises and do some deployments yourself. So for that, we chose to install XebiaLab, or rather provision XebiaLabs through the Docker container images. So again, using our same Cloud9 IDE, what we're going to do in the next part of the flow is essentially pull those images down. And along with that, we're also going to pull down a container image for Jenkins as well. So all of this really ties in through some CloudFormation stacks, right? So how are you going to provision the environment initially? Well, by cloning the environment, by having our Cloud9 IDE, and by leveraging the AWS CLI, we're able to execute some of these CloudFormation templates that we provided for you to do a couple different things, and we'll cover those in essentially 3 stages. The first of which is going to be provisioning our own container registry service, Amazon ECR, which we'll use later on to take those images that we've pulled and push them to that ECR registry. So why we're doing this? Well, AWS services work very well together. They have very tight integrations. So again, considering that we're going to be deploying our infrastructure, our initial infrastructure of XL release, deploy, and Jenkins on Fargate, it made sense to have our images in ECR from that perspective. But again, you know, outside of that, as you're building your applications, you're looking to modernize applications, you might want to start with an initial image that you might have pulled from, you know, your Docker hubs, but then you might also want to add additional layers to that image. And for that, you can also push those into ECR later on down the road. The next stage for the examples that we're going to provide are then provisioning your Jenkins container on Fargate, and then subsequently your XL release and XL deploy. Now, I mentioned Fargate, and Tim also mentioned how it's going to be newly supported in the XebiaLabs platform. For those of you that don't know, everybody's heard container, everybody's heard about Docker. If you may or may not know, Fargate is our compute engine for Amazon ECS and EKS. So what this does is it allows you to run containers without having to manage servers or clusters or setting any of that up. You're able to do this, and it scales for you automatically in terms of the orchestration layers and things like that. So it allows you to focus on designing and building your applications instead of managing a complicated infrastructure. Now, when it comes to Fargate, you have 2 modes that you can launch ECS and EKS. There's Fargate launch type, and then there's also EC2 launch type. Again, since we're speaking specifically of the Fargate launch type, this is a fully managed service. So the only thing that you really need to configure are CPU requirements, some IAM policies or permissions, and then just run your application. Now, Tim mentioned that there are situations where, you know, you might want to adhere to compliance and government requirements, and for that, you know, EC2 launch type might be a better fit for you at that point. But for the purposes of the examples I'm going to share, we chose the simple Fargate launch type just to have everything fully managed. So I'm going to go ahead and escape out of this slide, and I'm going to go ahead and go into my browser real quick, just to kind of walk through a couple of these things that I mentioned in that slide. So first and foremost, with the GitHub repo, if you visit the XebiaLabs org on GitHub and look for the AWS webinar repo, you'll find the examples that I'm mentioning. So I'll kind of walk through this real quick. So going into resources, first of all, you'll have a copy of the PowerPoint deck that we are presenting to you today. So this is available to you, so you can browse that later on in addition to the recording. But also more importantly, and more relevant rather to what I'm speaking to, Under the modules section, you'll have some of these sample code modules that I referenced to. So we'll have it getting started, so we could start there, and I'll kind of walk you through this. So we have a README doc that walks through every single step of going through these exercises, which you could do at a later time to provision that initial environment. And again, these are very much focused on having a Cloud9 environment, but that does not preclude you from running through these exercises. You're more than welcome to do that in your own environment if you chose to do so. So we'll have these modules getting started just to get, as it implies, get you set up with your environment. We have a container registry environment, which again walks you in very detailed steps on how to provision the ECR service in your AWS account, using CloudFormation as well. So those templates are provided for you, and also doing the Docker pulls, etc. And then we also have under the Jenkins, the same thing, CloudFormation templates and a Jenkins container. But then more importantly here on the XebiaLabs section, we have two things for you. We have the XL platform on Fargate, which is the examples that we're showing on provisioning both of these products as containers in a Fargate cluster. But then we also have a bonus. We have a DevOps as code fully functional demo that will take you through the process of deploying an application in your environment. So I'm going to quickly go through this Cloud9 environment real quick. As I pointed out, so the instructions cover this in detail, so we're not going to go into the granular details about this, but I did want to present it just so that you'd have a glimpse of what it will look like as you start going through those exercises. So in this case, I'm using this as my primary desktop environment to do this. As you can see, I have a navigation pane which has the exact same scaffolding that you saw in that Git repo, and the reason for that is because I was able to clone this repo. So I'm actually in the local version of that. And it's up to date with the branch that I have cloned. From there, I can also then CD and then run those commands to the respective modules and then run those CloudFormation templates. I also was able to pull down my images. Looks like I had an environment issue here. I did have it earlier, but apologize for that. And then subsequently, if I had done this ahead of time, we have the templates completed in the environment here. And we also have, as you can see, the XebiaLabs repositories in ECR, as well as the Amazon ECS running on Fargate with XebiaLabs, XL release, XL deploy, and Jenkins as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pause real quick now and hand it over back to you, Tim.
Okay, thanks, Jay. I am going to switch back to PowerPoint. Oops, sorry. All right, so thanks, Jay. That's really fantastic. So hope folks understood the multiple components there of configuring the environment that's going to manage your software releases by pulling down the images of the XebiaLabs platform tools. In this case, we also included Jenkins, but there may be other products that you're using as part of your build and release and your entire CD pipeline. So the ability to kind of create this environment where all of those tools are available to the development teams in this highly automated self-service manner is really important. But then the other piece is once you've built that environment and you're able to quickly configure that, it comes time to actually do the release of the software. And that's what that second piece, the full example that Jay mentioned in the GitHub repo. So what I'm going to show you here is just a really quick view of the XL release interface, just to give you a sense of what to expect when you go and try out that sample for yourself. So as I mentioned before, XL release is really looking to orchestrate that overall release process, right? So all of the different phases and tasks that are required to get that value out to your customer. are orchestrated within the product. And it really, the metaphor of orchestra is actually apt here. In many ways, if you think about the conductor of an orchestra is kind of looking at the entire piece and working together with each of the musicians who are really the experts in each of their instruments, right? So you've got your string section and your woodwinds and your brass and all of the musicians in those individual instruments, they're the experts there, but the conductor's job is to understand how they all fit together and how does the movements of the orchestral piece flow from one to the other, keep tempo, keep everyone working together. And that's really the role that XL Release plays here. So what you're seeing is a representation of that release that you're going to be able to run in flight here. We use, in this view, a metaphor that's similar to a Kanban board. So anyone who's used that kind of visualization of a multi-step process will find this very familiar, but you can also switch to tabular or other views of the steps. But essentially what you see here are 3 columns that represent 3 phases in that software release pipeline. We have a deploy phase, sort of quick test phase, and then followed by a cleanup. And the build phase would most likely include that call out to the Jenkins job that you saw before. So you'll have that step, that task in there as well. So as a developer, I'm able to set this up and say that in each phase, I'm going to have certain tasks that are going to leverage these other tools to carry out all of the phases and tasks within my release. So here, what you'll see when you take that sample application is we're starting this release manually. Some organizations want to have entirely automated releases, so maybe a commit triggers a build automatically, and that Jenkins build might trigger the flow of the entire release pipeline. But in many organizations, you want to have a manual kickoff. Maybe it's a Monday morning meeting when the team gets ready and says, hey, are we ready to bring this new version to production? So you can mix and match automated and manual tasks with the XebiaLabs platform. And of course, all of these are subject to rich access control to make sure who can initiate and carry out certain tasks, who can modify the release templates and so forth. And also by orchestrating them together, just to touch back on some of those scalability issues for the enterprise that we mentioned before, we get this visibility for other folks in the organization. Everyone can come in and see exactly where the release is, but we also get that compliance piece because we know behind the scenes, every single step, what happened when, who was involved, and it makes it very, very easy to answer compliance needs around reporting. So this will be the main UI. Behind the scenes, we represent this as code as well. So if a developer is more comfortable writing the release using code, we support that. That artifact itself can be part of the software release process and be used just like any other piece of code, put under source code control, peer code review, and so forth. But by having these multiple visual representations, it'll allow those non-technical participants as well to understand what's happening in the release. Now, we've abstracted somewhat some of that, that complexity of the AWS component through this UI, because we're just saying to go ahead and provision your ECS cluster or deploy the application. And we can drill into that more deeply on the XL deploy side, the deployment automation piece. And here you'll see each of these stages are really tying back to all of the pieces that, that Jay put together in those files before. So we've defined our environments in AWS, we understand our infrastructure, and by mapping our application to it through this model, it makes it very, very easy to automatically have that deployment occur, and then also to roll it back if something were to go wrong. And if you remember, when we talked about those high performers, the ability to recover from potential problems is as important as the ability to kind of get those applications out and running. So these two UIs of the XebiaLabs products are running in a web user interface that themselves will be running in containers using Fargate through the files that Jay just walked us through. So in this case, we could potentially have a completely self-service environment for a dev team to spin up the tools that are able to manage and orchestrate the release, as well as the environments to which the software itself is going to be ultimately deployed, all in this highly reusable, highly easily maintained environment that's leveraging both the AWS services as endpoints for the app. I'm going to deploy that app in a container in Fargate, or maybe I want to just deploy directly to EC2, or even things like Lambda functions and API endpoints. We can manage all of that, but we can also manage the entire pipeline. Now, one thing I did want to, I'm going to kind of throw Jay a sudden question here. I was just out at Amazon's headquarters, and another component of this that I got really excited about was this idea of the service catalog as sort of yet another way to kind of wrap up a bunch of these pieces into an easy to manage set of offerings that you could expose to developers on AWS. So Jay, I presume that all of the stuff that we've looked at today could work for one of these service catalog offerings?
Yeah, that's right. And as you mentioned, one of the benefits of using Service Catalog is ensuring compliance with corporate standards and helping your staff quickly find and be able to deploy approved services. So absolutely can be done that way.
Great. And again, all of this points back to the that need for visibility, compliance, and control for the enterprise, while still managing the freedom that developers need to pick their tools and pick their platforms and be highly self-sufficient and able to do some of these self-serve solutions. So by combining the XebiaLabs platform for visibility and coordination and orchestration of the release with the AWS services, especially when you wrap that all up as a service catalog offering, you really strike that balance, the best of both worlds of the control, the visibility, the repeatability that enterprises need, but still that really easy self-service, fast way for development teams to be able to manage their own process and get their software deployed where they need to, when they need to, in a safe and repeatable way. So that's brought us up to perfect time to switch over to a couple of questions. I think we're just about on schedule, so we could probably fit a handful of questions here. If I want to bounce it back to you, Charlene, I think you might be watching this.
Yeah, so we do have a couple questions in so far, but if you have a question for either Tim or Jay, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question, and we'll go ahead and hopefully get to as many as we can. The first question is, how do you automate change management while ensuring high stability or availability and faster release schedule?
Yeah, so I'll speak a little bit of that from the XebiaLabs platform perspective, and Jay can chime in as well. Oh, I will. Sorry, I'm just looking at the slides here. I will point out this XebiaLabs bus tour that we're doing in coordination with AWS. So you can come to those cities and those dates. We're taking over some of the best brew pubs in the US to have an opportunity to hang out with folks and meet you and talk about some of these challenges, but also some of these solutions. So take a look there. And I'm pretty sure change management when you get to the pub is fine. Just have another beer and switch to a different flavor. You'll be good to go.
Don't drink and drive.
You're right. So to come back to the question, yeah. So when we think about change management, it's obviously there's a number of different components, but fundamentally we're talking about tracking, managing changes to all of the components of our software release process. And that could be artifacts, it could be the requirements, it could be responding to other components and elements of it. Obviously, with a tool like XL Release as the orchestration part of the platform, you're able to do that by leveraging the expertise of some of those other tools, right? So if you use something like JFrog Artifactory to control change in components, great. If you use ServiceNow to track things, if you're using Jira We integrate with all of those products, so those are all able to be represented as part of that CD pipeline that we're managing. But then I'd also point out that a lot of folks, when they think about change management, they also tend to forget about the release itself, right? So how are you looking at the pipeline itself, and who is able to modify that pipeline, and what parts are optional and what are not, and how do you version that, and how do you see that things have changed over time? By using a tool like the XebiaLabs platform, you're going to have that insight that's required to handle change management to the actual process of building software, not just the various artifacts and requirements. So that would be, from our perspective, is kind of two pieces. It's leveraging the change management capabilities of best of breed tools, whether that's from your source code through artifacts or other things, and then leveraging the platform itself to give you control over management of the process. So Jay, anything from your perspective you want to add?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Tim. And in fact, I'm glad you brought up JFrog Artifactory in that response, because we didn't really talk about it before when we were talking about compliance, but tools like JFrog Artifactory, which are also AWS partners, provide binary repository management functionality into your pipeline process, right? So what that really means, though, is it provides you granular control of those dependencies that you're including in your application, so that, number one, as you're building out your apps and you're pulling from external resources, you obviously have to question whether or not you trust that resource. So this allows your teams, your security teams, to be able to vet those dependencies and also be able to cache them, both from external dependencies, but also from internal dependencies as well. So to speak primarily to the stability aspect of your question, that's certainly one consideration. Now, from a deployment perspective as well, or rather looking at it from 30,000 foot view, automating change management and ensuring stability and availability and all these things that lead to faster release schedule, it really is predicated on having visibility into every stage of the process. So for that, consider notifications, and consider also how it is that you're deploying to your fleet. So at AWS, one of the things that we do is use this concept of canary deployments. So for those who may not be familiar with the term, what we're essentially doing is grouping our deployments into various segments. So again, from an AWS perspective, your resources exist, in regions, availability zones, etc. So canary deployments are actually running in as part of your fleet and serving production traffic. So one way to mitigate that with that change, after you've already established some of these prerequisites, like your Artifactories and maybe other tools that do static code analysis and things like that, is then controlling that deployment process. So starting out with a canary deployment at a bare minimum, and then doing some synthetic traffic testing and unit testing to make sure that the components that your application is delivering to your customers are actually fulfilling that end-to-end, and then providing that notification back. If you're doing this on AWS, we have Lambda functions that are available. If you're in the Lambda console, you can actually search for the term canary under blueprints, and you'll have some sample code that you can use to achieve this functionality. And then once that's successful and you've had that validation process, then you can continue that deployment process to zonal deployments or subzonal deployments, etc. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, that's great. And again, glad you mentioned blue-green and canary deployments. That's also something that's automated really well in the XebiaLabs platform too. So take a look at that. We have a blog post, I think, that just went up a month or two ago, I think, that looks at dark launches, canary releases, blue-green deployments, a lot of these patterns that you were just talking about. So I think it's a great opportunity to learn a little bit more there and see how both of the tools fit together.
Awesome. Okay, great. Next question. Have you seen security monitor teams integrate security playbooks with CICD pipelines from a monitoring and response perspective?
Jay, you want to start? You want me to start?
Yeah, if you could start, I'd actually would ask specifically, what do you mean by security playbooks?
Yeah, and monitoring response too. Maybe the person who submitted the question can clarify a bit. But let me talk a little bit in general about security in the CI/CD pipeline from our perspective, and then the kind of real-time monitoring response. I'll talk to how that fits in as well. So obviously, a core part of our belief when it comes to CD and digital transformation is that good software is secure. Just that in the same way that you wouldn't bolt quality on as an afterthought, you shouldn't do the same thing with security. So we firmly believe in making security an ongoing and natural part of the process from the very beginning. And that's what you'll hear the portmanteau of DevSecOps now coming along. That's really touching on that. So it's something I'm really passionate about. I've done work in application security for a number of years, and it's something we take pretty seriously. Generally, when it comes to the CD pipeline, from the XebiaLabs perspective, security should be just another one of those components of the overall process. So if you can imagine that Kanban board again with your different phases, maybe you have a dev phase and a test and a UAT and a staging and then a production. What you ideally should be doing is finding all of those security elements that might be captured in your playbook, but how do those weave into that entire release process? And you'd add those into the XL release template that provides that map of your release. So that could be something like doing automated security testing as part of your build process with a static analysis tool or dynamic analysis tool. It could be having manual tasks in there that give your security team an opportunity to indicate that they've had a discussion with the development team early on in the process. Maybe you're doing some architectural risk analysis or some other kind of tasks that fall outside of the automated pipeline, but that you really want to capture and make sure that those happen. That's going to be a very welcome capability for the audit and compliance teams later to say that, yep, every single release that meets these certain criteria, that follows this pipeline, has these tasks that happen in it. And then you'll also do it by calling out to the third-party tools directly. So if you're using a third-party security analysis tool or an automated pen testing tool or any of these kinds of products, the XL release task that represents that can actually go out and communicate to that tool and say, here it is, it's ready for you to do your scan on this piece of source code or whatever that task is, and then report back in the pipeline to show whether that was successful or not. And one part of the XebiaLabs UI that I didn't show is all about risk, and it looks at all of the releases that are in flight and helps you understand which ones are going fine. Hopefully 90% of the time they're just going to kind of chug away, but sometimes, as we saw, the change failure rate is exceptionally low in high performers, but it does happen. So what we do is we look at a number of factors that contribute to potential risk, things like manual tasks being overdue or automated tasks like a build failing. But you can also add security to that, and you can say if there are security tasks that are failing, that's automatically going to raise the risk of your release. So you might want to think about those kinds of things as well. It's not only integrating the security tasks at the right time naturally throughout the CD pipeline, but it's also raising the visibility to the rest of the team if something is going wrong. And then that third part being the recording it all, making sure that that you can easily kind of provide that insight into what you did for security at a later time for compliance purposes.
All right.
And I'd also like to add to that as well. I mean, if we're looking at it as we discussed before, you can introduce tools in security should be part of every phase of your deployment process, and it begins with static code analysis. We also talked about binary repository managers like JFrog as another security tool to mitigate where those dependencies are coming from. But there's also AWS Systems Manager as well that does scanning of your environment and allows you to maintain security and compliance from that perspective, as well as whichever other monitoring tools you might be using, like your Sumo Logics, Splunks, and what have you.
All right, great. We're looking at about 5 minutes left until the top of the hour, so, or 5.5 minutes. So I think we have time for one more question. How does Fargate compare to Kubernetes?
I'd be happy to answer that one. So just to keep things in perspective, Fargate is our managed service. It allows you to run containers, both ECS as well as EKS, which is running Kubernetes as well. So as far as that's concerned, I just wanted to make that distinction clear. So there is no direct comparison because it's not a replacement for Kubernetes, but it is, again, a managed service that allows you to run Kubernetes in AWS.
Okay. All right. Great.
And the XebiaLabs piece supports both, right? So if you have containers and you want to run them on Kubernetes on-prem or EKS or any other way, great, no problem. Those applications can be deployed there or in any combination. Or if you want to take advantage of Fargate, again, it's seamless from the developer's perspective. So we're really excited to give that capability to enterprises where the teams can pick and choose and use whichever approach to a containerized workload makes the most sense for them. All
right, great. So I have one bonus question then that might actually tie into what you just said, Tim. And it talks about the demo. It says this demo is fairly traditional monolithic applications. What about microservices?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and if you go into the sample app here, it's actually a Java application that we give you that you can actually deploy. So yeah, certainly this works with traditional software, but containers and microservices are, it's chocolate and peanut butter, right? They go perfectly hand in hand. So everything that we looked at today is really, really well suited to folks who are exploring microservices as an architecture for their application. Containers are a great way to sort of package and deploy each of those services. I will say the additional benefit with having a platform that helps you with this when it comes to microservices is, microservices do introduce additional complexity when it comes to versioning and understanding kind of where all of the components of your application have been deployed, how do they talk to one another? If you have to roll back a change in one, does that impact others? So managing and tracking all of that in a kind of manual way can quickly become way too complicated for a team. So by having a platform that can help you orchestrate that, not only are you taking advantage of the technical benefits that containers give for a lightweight way to move those around, but it also gives you that visibility to really understand the entire microservices architecture. And you can kind of create these release pipelines, these CD pipelines that have multiple sub-releases that might correspond to the different microservices that make up your whole application solution.
All right. Great. Well, that is about all the time that we have for the questions. I do want to thank everybody who did submit a question, and they were really good questions. So thanks again. I want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, you have the opportunity to listen to it on demand. And this afternoon, we should be sending out an email that has a link to the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website. So if you are there and you want to listen to the webinar, just go to the webinar section on the website, look under on demand, and it should be there waiting for you. We also have a ton of other webinars on demand and upcoming on the site. So take a poke around. Hopefully there'll be at least one or two that pique your interest. Right now, it just leaves me to thank Tim Buntel and Jay Yaras for joining me today. Thank you both, gentlemen. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Charlene. It's great to be here. And come and go to that GitHub repo, and we'll see you all on the other side. Thanks.
All right. All right. Great. Well,
thank you all.
Thank you. This is Charlene O'Hanlon hanging up, signing off. Have a great day, everybody.